Even if your interests in model railroading lean more towards operations, as is the case for me, scenery plays a big part in creating the illusion that we're looking for on our layouts. As layout owners, it can be easy to ignore the fact that your layout has no scenery. You kind of get used to it, and you become blind to those missing elements. That can be great for you, but for others it might be a little jarring. Even if you have structures in place, the lack of other scenic elements immediately tells viewers that they're looking at a model. So what can we do about it? Stay tuned and find out. Hi everybody, I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. In this episode, we're going to continue working on scenery for the small layout I'm calling the Grunge. At the end of the last episode, the Grunge looked like this. In that installment, we started scenery on the east end of the layout near American Can. But as you can see, there was still a lot missing. There was bare ground, and this still wasn't even close to a convincing scene. That was Phase 1. If you missed it, I suggest you check that video out first. In this episode, we move on to Phase 2. Adding road lines and another delivery area, putting in a ramp for the team track, and filling a good chunk of the area between the tracks with dirt and static grass. We've got a lot of ground to cover, literally, so let's get moving. In the first scenery video, I put down some of the delivery area pavement as well as the streets, but I didn't get to the delivery area on the west side of the building. This was a more irregular shape than the other side because I wanted it to curve to fit against the spur. So to get the correct shape, I took some craft paper and using a pencil, marked the location of the rail. Then, using scissors, I cut along that line. Well, mostly. I took off a little bit of extra to account for the edges of the ties. I didn't measure that out, I just eyeballed it. With this template in place, I taped it to the cork sheet, which happened to be the same width as the craft paper. And once again, using scissors, I cut it down to size. Once cut, I remove the craft paper template, then test fit the cork by simply placing it into the appropriate spot to make sure it fit snugly, and that there were no places where it would kink due to excess material. It did require a couple of minor tweaks, but once I trimmed those spots, it fit like a glove. I glued the cork down with plain white glue and put some weights on it to dry. This is the same method I used before, and that's because this was all done at the same time as the cork installation that I showed in the earlier video. Now, as I did with the cork for the delivery dock on the east side of the building and the streets, I painted the edge black using craft paint, just so that the brown color wouldn't show through. Putting the building back in place, I used 2 pieces of scrap paper taped together to make another template. Once again, I used a pencil to mark the location of the track edge. I also traced around the edge of the building. This would allow me to cut that piece out so that the building sits right on the cork, not on the foam. Finally, I marked the edge of the cork so that I'd know where to stop cutting. As before, I used painted foam, and I showed this process for painting in the last video. In a nice stroke of luck, it turned out that the remaining scrap from cutting out the streets and the east side delivery dock from last time left just enough material on that sheet and in the right configuration for me to cut what I needed for the west side. This time, the pavement needed to go right up to the edge of the track, so no trimming would be required. I taped the template to that piece of foam and used scissors to cut it out. I test fit the foam by putting the building back in place. Much like with the cork, I needed to trim a couple of small bits, but for the most part, it was a great fit. Prior to this, when I glued the foam to the cork, I used the same method as I did with the cork itself. Namely, glue it down, put a lot of weight on top to make sure it stays flat, and wait around. But after my last video, I got a tip from Rob Ott, who suggested that instead, I put white glue on both surfaces, wait for 5 to 10 minutes, and then attach them. His claim was that once the 2 surfaces were mated, it would provide a near-instant bond. Well, I tried this on the foam, and it seemed to work out pretty well. Everything adhered nicely, except for a couple of corners where I hadn't used enough glue. Thanks, Rob! I now needed to scenic the large area around the American Can plant, the main line, and the team track. My plan here was to use static grass to cover that area. Although I've used pre-made static grass mats before, I've never actually applied static grass myself, so this was going to be a new experience. What could go wrong? Before I put down the grass, though, I wanted to have a dirt base underneath, since in my head this area was going to be patchy and uneven, kind of a scraggly area where there isn't a lot of coverage. So I started out by putting down some coarse dirt in between the main line and the team track off camera. I used white glue to glue it in, and then once it was dry, vacuumed up the excess. Fear not, I'll be showing the method I used here shortly. I used real dirt that I gathered on a field trip to Pennsylvania. Even though it's just dirt, I don't want to waste it, so once again, I used the nylon on the nozzle to catch the excess, and then dumped the dirt back into my container after sifting out any large chunks. Now when you're doing this, the nozzle can fill up pretty quickly, so you might have to stop and empty the sock multiple times before you can get all the material vacuumed up. That section looked good, but I needed to do the same thing between the main track and the American Can spur. I filled the areas between the main line and the spur for American Can with my mixture of 2 parts glue to 1 part water to 1 part alcohol. I then applied the dirt through another sifter so that it wouldn't go on too clumpy. I covered this area until there were no wet spots showing. Since I was going to recollect any dirt that didn't stick, I really wasn't worried about overdoing it. While that dried, I moved on to the bumper I wanted to use for the team track. Back in January, when I was at the Amherst Railway Big Hobby Show, I picked up these end bumpers here. They're from Osborne Model Kits, and these are laser cut wood. They're pretty simple, and I didn't bother to show putting these together just because it's literally 4 pieces. Then they suggest you paint these an oxide red, which I did. Some time ago at a convention of some sort, I saw a diorama that had a bumper on it that I was quite taken with in terms of how it looked and the way that it blended into the scenery and so on, and I've kept that picture on hand to try and replicate it. And this team track area seems like a really good place to kind of try to replicate this. So you'll notice in the photo that it's really quite rusty, and that is the effect that I also wanted to get. So I'm going to use my rust effects from Vallejo and really dirty this up. And the thing that I like about it is as you layer things on here, it really does give you the texture of rust, which I really like. So this I'm gonna, this is supposed to have been there quite some time, so I'm gonna really dirty this up here. But you'll notice I'm dabbing rather than sort of brushing, and so I'm gonna give this some of that texture. And then what I will also probably do is go over this with pan pastels. With the glue dry on the dirt between the spur and the main line, I once again vacuumed up the excess. I then took some time to remove any dirt that might have gotten stuck to the side of the rail to make sure that cars could move in and out freely. I went in and did this with a dental pick, which I discussed in my video about 5 inexpensive tools on model railroading. So now we're going to try out static grass. I decided on a set of colors ranging from light to dark green, and also a yellow fiber that would represent dead grass. The yellow's open because I decided to do a test, since I'd never really done any static grass on anything. So I used the yellow and another mix that comes with the applicator for that test. You can see here that I've rubbed this part over here with my finger. That's to kind of indicate that trucks will come on this side of the team track for access. I need to probably build this up a little more so that it's level with the sidewalk there, so that would be their access. We'll worry about that as we go. Based on what I've seen, the recommendation is to fill the hopper about 1/3 of the way with the fibers. We're going to put a relatively random mix of the colors in the applicator. I'll go light on the yellow since the idea is that there are just some dead bits mixed in with the rest. Then I'll add proportionally more of the greens. Most of these are 4mm fibers, but a bag of 2mm mixed color fibers also got thrown in for some variety. I didn't use any kind of formula, I just eyeballed it. I will say that the hardest part of this whole process was getting the fibers out of the bags and into the hopper without making a complete and total mess. I do recommend using a piece of paper underneath to catch the stray fibers. That came in quite handy. For glue, I used a mixture of white glue and water. I tried for a mixture of 1/3 water to 2/3 glue, but it took some experimentation to get the thickness right. As a result, I ended up with way more glue mixture than I needed. So this was all glued down with white glue, which means that if you wet it, it's going to loosen up and potentially come up. So I'm using the brush here, and we're just going to kind of coat this area. I used a thin brush as well as a larger chip brush to spread the glue. This allowed me to fill differently sized areas relatively quickly. Just a reminder, this channel covers model railroading, including planning, hints, tips, how-tos, and updates. Click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode, and press the bell so you'll get notified when there's new content available. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Links are in the description below. And what I don't know is if I put enough static grass in here. I decided to try using the nozzle for the static grass, as someone mentioned that it was easier to cover small areas with it. More on that in a second. The methodology for static grass is this. There's a battery inside which, when you turn the power on, gets converted to high voltage but low current. The clip grounds the machine to the area, so you want that clip to be touching the layout or touching a piece of metal on the layout, either one. You then tap the hopper to get the fibers to drop out. The static charge that's generated makes the fibers stand up on edge when it hits the glue, and it'll dry that way, giving the impression of standing blades of grass. I learned pretty quickly that I didn't actually like the nozzle, so I returned to the large grate and had more success for an area of this size. Maybe the nozzle's better for some applications, I don't know. Now, remember when I said I wanted this to be rough and scraggly? Yeah. As you can see, I totally forgot about that, and I'm putting on a pretty even and pretty heavy coating of the fibers. More on that in a minute. Now, I'm cutting down what I'm showing you of this process quite a bit. If you're interested in seeing the full process, I'll be posting a video on my Patreon channel shortly. Join and check it out, as well as getting access to other great perks. After giving the area a decent coating, I decided to stop and let things dry a little bit. That gave me a chance to go back to my bumper. Everything's dried on there. It's got a nice texture to it, but it's a little too consistent, I guess. I'm looking for some variations of the rust color. See what we can do here with various colors of pan pastels. Right. So now we've got a pretty mottled looking bumper. That's M-O-T-T-L-E-D, not M-O-D-E-L-E-D. So even though this area where the coupler would hit the bumper looks pretty good, I'm going to dab some paint on there with a paint marker just to drive that point home a little bit. Since this isn't going to get handled very much, I'm not going to bother to seal it. I'm just going to install it as is. Okay, even though this isn't completely dry, I've emptied the hopper into this container that I'm going to use for this mix, and I am going to vacuum this up and see where we stand, because hopefully there's nothing sticking here on this dirt area that I wanted for the truck access, and hopefully there's nothing sticking along these footings. So we're going to put the little sock back on the vacuum cleaner and see what we get. As with the dirt, I needed to stop fairly frequently to empty the excess grass fibers out of the sock back into the container. Actually, I had to stop even more frequently than I did with the dirt. The one piece that I'm not thrilled with is here, and this is my own fault. I put some glue in here because this is where I want to put the bumper. So our bumper is going to sit in here like this. And I wanted to glue in some of the grass there. And you know, unfortunately it spread a little too much, so we've got some stuff here that I'll probably have to scrape up, and it got into this area here. Once this dries a little bit, I'll probably go back and put some more dirt in here, which I was planning to do anyway because there's too much of a drop here. It'd be easier to see from this angle how much of a drop there is here, and if the thought is that trucks are coming up and over this to get in here, that's a huge HO scale drop for those trucks. You can see that that's just a massive drop there. We'll fill that in, but overall I'm thinking that's looking pretty good. What I still have to go back and do is the dirt and the grass in between the tracks, but I wanted to see how this was going to come out first in case I needed to redo it. We'll have to poke around with some of these footings and make sure that, you know, these just look like weeds that are kind of growing up and around. But I think in general that gives a pretty good look of an overgrown area. Maybe at some point later I'll go back and put in some even longer stuff, maybe 8mm or 10mm in some places to really show weeds. But I think for a start, this is pretty good. I'm happy with this. So after showing this to my wife Laura, she commented that it's a little too even. Commented that this area over here looked a little bit too much like a golf course, which I tend to agree with given what this is supposed to be. In order to remove some of the grass that I'd put on, I just used my dental tool to scrape bits off and then vacuumed up the excess once again. In addition, I also added some dirt to cover some of the area and make it look a little less even. I also added dirt, as I mentioned, to build up the area where trucks would enter. In order to break the surface tension, I wet the area with alcohol and then covered it with glue. The other thing that happened was I was handling this and I ended up breaking off this piece. I guess the moral of that story is once it's dry, don't try to bend it. That was a Joe problem, not a product problem. A couple places in here where the glue didn't quite get diluted as much as I might have liked. So I am going to actually cover this up with some foliage clusters here. I'm going to use these. Rip a couple of these off here. I guess as long as we're here, I'll take care of this bumper as well. So I've got some things drying here, and I want to fill in the centers of the tracks with just dirt. But I don't want it to be too thick, so I'm going to go a little easy here, and we'll use the brush to spread things out a little bit. So with this stuff in place, I'm just going to brush things along a little bit. Get it so that the dirt is sort of below the ties. When I do glue this stuff down, I'm going to stay away from the points. That way we don't get into a situation where everything's kind of locked down, and whatever's left and loose at the end, we will vacuum up. Alright, some of the dirt is in there. Run a bead of alcohol in here to break the surface tension in there. Like I said, I'm avoiding the points in there. So with the alcohol there to break the barrier down, I shouldn't need too much in the way of glue here to get that stuff to lay down. Just kind of trying to get a drop in between each tie. And that should be enough to get it to stick. A couple of places where things have beaded up, I'm just going to go back and put some more alcohol in there to hopefully get it to snuggle down in those crevices and so on. I've got my fan here, and I'm just going to set this on the low setting, let this sit for a couple of hours, and we'll come back, see if everything stuck. Okay, everything dried. I've already vacuumed up the excess and so on. What I did notice, and this hasn't happened before, and I'm not 100% sure why it happened, but in some of the places where I put the glue and the alcohol mixture down, it turned the ties a shade of white. Some of the worst offenders I've already gone over with the markers here to kind of cover it up, so it shouldn't look too bad. Also tried out a pencil that made things a little shiny, so I wasn't quite thrilled with that. But I think this turned out pretty well and it comes close to matching that photo that I was trying to replicate. So next I want to put the stripes in the road. I ordered some striping from Highways and Byways. I saw the results of using these on Don Iris's Providence and Worcester layout. I really like how they turned out. I've never used them before, but we'll see how they come out together. The street here is 22 square feet wide. I'm going to do some markings here so I can get the lines to be as straight and prototypical looking as possible. So I'm going to take my Micron pen. I've been using these for a long time. This particular one is a 005. It's the thinnest one that they make. We want to have almost a scale foot in the middle. Lines in the United States anyway are typically 4 inches wide with 6 inches in between them. So I'm going to try and mark this up. I may be off just a little bit just because of the size of things here, but I don't think that's going to throw things off too much. Given that this is 22, just shy of 22 feet wide, we take a scale foot out of the middle, that's 21, divide that by 2, and we're looking at 10.5 feet. Now this has a extra foot on the end, so we want to mark this at what this says is 9.5 feet. And I'll do that again up here. And that's going to become the outer edge for our lines. So these are just peel and stick kind of thing. If I can get my ruler to stop moving. Someone in one of my comments once mentioned that humans should be built with 3 hands, and I firmly agree. Sometimes that would make things so much easier, as in this particular case. There we go. Get that stuck down there now. Now, in the past I've been skeptical of using tape like this just because of the thickness that it has, but this stuff is pretty thin. Grab my pick here and try and peel this up just a little bit. Got a little bubble down here at the end. Twist up here at the top. These are pretty thin, and I think they're going to look okay. Okay, so that's not too bad. Scissors here and trim this piece off. That leaves us with this, which the adhesive is on the front. And we will once again just kind of eyeball this. And burnish it down. Probably ought to do that with the yellowness up. There we go. And like I mentioned, we'll burnish this yellow line down just a little bit so that it doesn't want to tend to come up. There's the lines there. These did come with railroad crossing, but for this side street I think that's a bit grand, so I'm not going to use those here. I'm going to repeat that process up here, which is the 9-foot marking. Not quite cut. That's the tree that I was talking about. Let's burnish those down a little bit. Okay, so now that those are down, those are really, really bright, especially given the area that we're supposed to be in here. So I am going to sort of color these up using some pan pastels here. I will probably also put, like I did over here, some spots down. So this time I've gone with the lower concentration India ink. Put some of those dots in various places. And I'm just doing this fairly randomly. We'll see how things come out in the wash, so to speak, no pun intended. So the light gray is really helping to tone that down. Grab my deer foam brush, which is my favorite brush for powders, just because it allows you to really blend things in. So, that black line looked a little too dark to my eye, a little too line-ish, I guess, but it's usually what you see in the center lanes is a sort of a darker tint to it. By blending all this stuff in, you can really tone things down, punch things up, however you want to do it. Going over the dark gray, the dark black with the light gray really does tone it down there. I think that looks pretty good. Go over this with the blending brush, as I always do, and we'll live with that for a little while. Changes need to be made, we can do that, but for right now I'm thinking it looks pretty good. So while I've got the pan pastels out and ready to go, I'm going to work on the unloading dock for the team track. I painted this using polyscale concrete the other day, using my airbrush. I did build this out using some just fake Lego pieces that I got at the dollar store, as well as some styrene. So the idea is that this will go along the tracks like this, and we just want to dirty this up a little bit. So here's how the layout looks with everything put together. As I said at the start, scenery makes a huge difference. Now, there's still about 65 inches of layout to scenic, but at least we've got a start. And maybe there'll be some front-end Friday shots popping up here and there soon. I should mention that the gravel in the foreground is not glued down. It's temporary until I decide what to do out there. So that's all for this episode. What do you think about the scenery so far? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. That is also the place for questions and suggestions. Make sure you subscribe and click on the bell. Let's get those YouTube algorithms moving in the right direction. Check out these playlists on your left to get more information on building the Grunge layout, as well as other great videos. I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll meet me next time in the train room.